In this lecture on cultural relativism and ethnocentrism, I'll discuss the definition of culture. I'll also talk about the human condition and different theories of the human condition, including determinism and coevolution. From there, I'll launch into a discussion of ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. We'll talk about applying culture and some ethnographic methods. So, what is culture? Anthropologists for a long time have grappled with the notion of what culture is. Particularly cultural anthropologists, this defines their field. It defines the work they do and the approaches they take to the study of culture. Definitions of culture from anthropologists are wide-ranging. Kroeber and Kluckhorn's definition from 1952 is very process-oriented, whereas E.B. Tyler's definition of culture is very much a list, more like a noun. Kroeber and Kluckhorn's is more processual, that it consists of patterns, explicit and implicit, of and for behavior acquired and transmitted by symbols constituting the distinctive achievements of human groups, including their embodiments of artifacts, which is the essential core of culture, which consists of traditional, which are historically derived and selected ideas. That is, they are not for all time. Traditional does not reference from time immemorial. And especially their attached values. Cultural systems may, on the one hand, be considered as products of action, and then the other as conditioning elements for further action. So here you see the processual nature of culture versus Tyler, which is a much more static definition of culture. From Lavenda and Schultz, they also consider, this is a more recent definition, human culture is a number of characteristics. First, it's learned and shared, that culture is being absorbed and modified by succeeding members of society. It's patterned in that different cultural traditions will intersect and sometimes contradict one another. And we see this with the tension that sometimes exists with religion and economy as a whole. Culture is adaptive in that cultural traditions are adjustable according to their surroundings in order to better survive their social and physical environments. In some cases, such as Easter Island, Chaco Canyon, or the American Bottom in Cahokia, we see these cultures as maladaptive over long periods of time. So this raises interesting questions about sustainability and long-term global problems in considering current manifestations of cultural solutions to these problems. It's also symbolic. Communications, such as language, for example, is a central part of cultural learning. And this is particularly the work of DeAndrade points out that the human brain co-evolved with the development of language. And language and the human brain co-developed along the cognitive capacities of human beings, which allowed us to modify particular niches to suit our own purposes. Potts has come up with 5 elements that can create a composite basis of culture. Indeed, in biological anthropology, anthropologists investigate what makes us similar to or different from other animals and organisms. Many other organisms share the first 5 features. The idea of transmission or copying behavior, memory or traditions being remembered, reiteration, reproducing behavior and or information, innovation, inventing new behavior, and selection, keeping needed innovations. Homo sapiens, particular with language, learn symbolic coding, which leads to language and institution building, potentially indicating that a coevolution of culture and the human brain. There are many theories about the human condition, many ways of conceptualizing the relationship of human beings and conceptualizing the differences or what separates us into discrete entities or a complex whole. These theories of dualism, these are philosophical view that realities consist of 2 equal and irreducible forces, and this comes from Plato's notion of the ideal and the material. In idealism, this is the philosophical view that ideas, or the mind that produces such ideas, constitute the essence of human nature, whereas materialism focuses on the material activities, our physical bodies, and the material world constitute the essence of human nature as a whole. There are several types of determinism. This is a theory that explains human nature as being determined by a single set of forces. There is environmental determinism, that is the essence of human beings that are essentially a composite of group or individual surroundings. So in relation to a particular environment like cold or arid or hot environments or tropical rainforest, that this will in essence shape the entirety of the human experience. Economic determinism, this notion comes from Marx, and this is related to labor and economic production, the social relations shaped by labor and economic production, in fact, are going to have broad ramifications throughout all of society as a whole. Anthropologists have increasingly gravitated towards a more holistic explanation, which incorporates mind and body. body and environment, individual society, and that they overlap with one another so that there are no discrete or rigid boundaries for each relational sphere. A lot of these studies come from cybernetics and ecological studies, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and society is a patterned configuration of social relations. Here we have coevolution and the simultaneous development of mental, physical, and behavioral components of human beings. If you relate more graphically to these concepts, we can think about dualism in terms of a reductionist approach where there's an emphasis on the material world or ideology. Holistic orientation of human nature looks at the notion of co-determination and coevolution of said characteristics of humanity as a whole. In terms of cultural relativism and ethnocentrism, these concepts matter quite a bit in cross-cultural interactions. And indeed, we see cultural differences that persist today. And this occurs in everything from body proxemics to thinking about things like economic systems, subsistence systems, religious beliefs and practices, in a wide array of kinship relations as well. A particular example of this occurred in Botswana with Peace Corps volunteers. In Swana culture, people do not spend time alone, and so the host's hospitality is never to leave anybody alone. Otherwise, this is a transgression of social norms. So Peace Corps volunteers would seek respite, seek some time alone, and Swana would essentially chase them down and not allow them any time alone. So there's a really high attrition rate that Peace Corps volunteers felt amongst the Swana. These cultural practices were misunderstood and later became incorporated into the training for Peace Corps volunteers in order to eliminate the really high rates of attrition of volunteers in Botswana amongst Swana culture. The concept of ethnocentrism relates to around the notion is one culture more correct or normal than another? Historically, this had been thought about in negative terms, that it may be often disrespectful to different ways of living and be accompanied by conversion tactics through contempt for members of other groups, hatred, and intolerance. But ethnocentrism can also be looked at in positive terms, that is, relating one's own culture to a different culture. Where are there common elements, and where are there cultural or social variations that are present? And indeed, it's through ethnographic study where we can come to evaluate accepted norms and perhaps widen perspectives in terms of what is acceptable behavior. Cultural relativism is paired with ethnocentrism. This goes to the notion of understanding another culture in its own terms as a coherent and meaningful design for living, recognizing that no culture is inherently superior to any other, and evaluating the beliefs and customs of a particular culture in the context of a culture itself. Much like economic and ecological determinism, cultural determinism is also flawed in its assumptions. It has three main assumptions about human society: that cultures are bounded categories that are isolated from one another, and that within cultures there's only one way to interpret experience, that cultures are monolithic, non-contradictory, and without variations, and that people are living these isolated cultures are essentially passively molded into adhering to a single worldview. Anthropologists have shown through extensive research that none of these is true in cross-cultural relationships. Indeed, cultures are not bounded categories. They come into contact with one another and dramatically influence one another. Within culture, you have intracultural variation, or variation in beliefs and practices within a culture, and that tradition is not something that is passively accepted by individuals. Rather, it is something that is taken from the past, it's historically derived and selected for. And so there's no passive molding of people into this mold of forming this perfect cultural citizen. Indeed, Marx notes that opportunities for individuals are limited by the historical and cultural context within which people find themselves. He notes that men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted by the past. And this goes to a larger discussion in anthropology and outside it as well, the freedom versus structure argument. To what extent or to what degree does human agency, choice, in the context of particular social limitations, play a particular role? And can there be a science of culture or human sciences when so much of human experience is individualistic, non-structured, and distinctive? And this has indeed been the call, even within anthropology, towards a more humanistic anthropology. There is, however, evidence for both structure and freedom in human culture, that human agents do not control their outcomes based on historical and the cultural and that human agents do control their outcomes, but this is based on the cultural and historical context of their particular actions. The related video in class shows female cutting or female genital mutilation. And indeed, much has been made concerning this, and anthropologists have come in and been brought in to explain what cultural behavior in a particular context. And so this notion of relativism has limits in the context of human rights or universal perspectives on what constitutes the unique rights of every individual. As Lavenda and Schultz note, culture is not a coherent, static set of values that are meant to be evoked uncritically, either when it gets in the way of applying universal human rights laws or when traditions need defending. And traditions change over time. In Bilestock and Whitman's piece on the Salish Reservation in Washington, they note that the reservation is in fact a complicated socio-historical context, and community members are immersed in multiple interconnected worlds. And this complexity is illustrated by one student who told of practicing drumming, listening to the latest download on his iPod, learning Salish, Spanish, and English, reading the Accelerated Reader program, and meeting with visiting Maori speakers, going to town and Walmart with his parents, and hauling firewood from his back porch, as well as shooting a buck from his back porch, all on the same day. And so this notes the very complicated, intertwined nature of everyday experience of indigenous peoples in the United States, in North America. Further, indigenous peoples utilize technologies that come from the outside. The question becomes, does this make them any less indigenous? As Yukon village leader pragmatically said to anthropologist Joseph Jorgensen regarding the use of technologies, and this often has occurred within the context of First Nations people in Canada, as well as Alaska Natives, using things like snowmobiles, snow machines, and high-powered rifles or outboard motors for fishing in order to get subsistence goods. And then if they're using these things, do they still have the right to subsistence practices? And Jorgensen records this from a Unalakleet elder who notes, "We take whatever technology works and shape it to our own purposes and uses. Apparently that bothers people who want us to remain pristine or to admit to our contradictions of wanting technology and controlling and preserving the resources of our own use. Why not? We have always accepted and reshaped technology that works for our own purposes." And so this is the notion of indigenizing modernity or indigenizing technology and utilizing it for particular cultural purposes. That technology in and of itself does not necessarily transform a culture, but can be incorporated within a culture and to suit the needs of cultural continuity overall. In terms of some different methods in field work overall, a lot of this has to do with gaining permission and access, and I talked about this in the context of my research on the Tohono Nation with institutional review boards, as well as seeking permission from local authorities. Fieldwork can be multi-sited in many different locations. Again, this involves an extended period of time in a given area. Participant observation would be observing as well as participating in a culture, and Frank Cushing's a primary example of this. He becomes essentially anthropology's first participant observer as he becomes a member of the priesthood of the bow amongst the Zuni. He's Tetsani, he's a medicine flower is his Zuni name, and he becomes fully incorporated into Zuni society as a whole. One can engage in behavioral observation, noting the difference between what people say and what people actually do. Anthropologists typically in the field will take extensive field notes on relationship of individuals, layout of communities, conversations that they've had, and other happenings. And then formal interviews and informal interviews, unstructured interviews, semi-structured interviews overall. And then there are changing locations of fieldwork in the United States. Historically, again, field work and anthropology have been something that was done outside the United States, where you have really calls for anthropology being with the Imperial Bureau of Ethnology. This is Hayden's call in England, and that here we really see stark cultural differences, and they became more apparent to the ethnographer working in these diverse locations. Today, increasingly we see ethnography at home. An example of this is Scott Hudson's work on the rave, where he talks about spiritual healing in a modern Western subculture. And he, rather than make assumptions about what happens at raves, he actually goes out and speaks with ravers, goes to online forums, and gets the perception of ravers themselves and talking about their own field work. So I hope to give you a little bit more perspective on the methods and approaches within anthropology and some of what goes into fieldwork, as well as a discussion of cultural relativism and ethnocentrism and notions of modernity and contemporary societies today.